Hello and welcome to a quick tutorial on drawing value diagrams. The agenda of this quick tutorial is to go through the dimensions of experiencing value and share the nomenclature of value diagrams. The motivating question for us is how can we make sure that our decisions are consistent with our values? And in order to do that, we realize that achieving clarity on value is a necessary first step. Before we begin, as an exercise, let's take a moment to make a list of things that you value in the context of a decision that you're facing. So it's easy to also do this just without a decision, but then it becomes philosophical, which also is important, which can give you insights. But for this exercise, I suggest that you think about a decision that you're facing and make a list of all the things that you value in the context of that decision and even connecting them with each other as you see fit. So pause the video now, and when you're done, move on. Now that you've done the exercise, let me share with you a framework that comes from the field of formal axiology, which I found incredibly helpful in thinking about value. There are three dimensions of the nature of value. There are those values that we call intrinsic. These are ends in themselves. Then there are prudential values, things that are good for us. They are means to an end. And then there are systemic values. These are constructs, rules, laws, ideologies that we've created to manage our world better. So anything that's artificial in our mind is a system. That's systemic value. Anything that's good for us, it's an instrumental value. It's going to get us somewhere, is a prudential value. And anything that's an end in itself, it's the end goal, is an intrinsic value. Intrinsic values tend to be an inseparable part of our identity. We can't tell where this value begins and ends. It's just a part of who we are. Prudential values are good for us because of some story we have to tell about it. So we can justify prudential values. In fact, that's a good test. If we can justify it, it's likely a prudential value. Systemic values are artificial. They have been created by us to help manage our world better. As an example, brushing our teeth is prudential, but brushing in the morning and night is a system we've created to get to that prudential value. So we could say, yeah, brushing our teeth is prudential all we want, but if we don't brush our teeth, that value is never going to come to us. So the system is really important. At the same time, the count of the number of times I've brushed is not the value that I'm after. It's really the health of my teeth and generally well-being that drives this. The system is just the way of getting there. Another example, valuing the life of a soldier killed in Afghanistan from the perspective of the commanding officer of that deceased soldier. So the commanding officer can do the valuation in all three dimensions. So the commanding officer can say, hey, I've lost a friend or a colleague who simply can't be replaced. This is such a big loss. A part of me has died. And at this level of valuation, talking about trade-offs is simply insulting. You just can't even begin to talk about the loss. At the level of prudential value, you got to deal with bad press, morale, inform family, send replacement, recruit more troops. A whole bunch of practical activities have to be done because there's a war being fought and a soldier is practical, very practical to have. You don't want to be assigned with fewer soldiers. So that's a purely practical valuation on a soldier's life. Yes, we do want our soldiers hale and hearty because they help us fight the war. At the level of systemic valuation, the number of troop deaths went up by 1. So here we see that the dimensionality is also a hierarchy of richness. At the intrinsic level, we don't even know where to begin in terms of experiencing the value. At the prudential level, we know where to begin, as in there are many practical things that we can enumerate. And at the systemic level, we've reduced the whole human life to a single number. So that's the dimensionality that we can use to perform valuation. So let's try another exercise. Look at the list of values that you just created for yourself. For each item in that list, put the label intrinsic, prudential, or systemic. This is important because this will lead into the next exercise, and a quick guide is that if you have an intrinsic value, the test that it's intrinsic is you can't tell me why it is important to you. If you have a prudential value, you generally have a story for why it is good for you. And if you have a systemic value, those are the kinds of values that typically tend to be either imposed on you or a rule that you've adopted for yourself. So you find it important to count something or follow a particular rule in your life. Those are systemic values. So you can do this exercise in a general context, as in just values that guide your life, or to make it even more interesting, you can pick a decision situation that you're facing right now, and in that context you can lay out these values. So do the exercise again, look at the list of values that you wrote down a little earlier, and try to identify which of these are intrinsic, prudential, and systemic. And in the process of doing this, you might discover that you may not have enough intrinsic values, and you may need to dig deeper and discover your intrinsic values. Or you might need some prudential values that you may not have had in the earlier exercise. So let the labels kind of spark your thinking, and if you need to put down more values or delete some stuff which is subsumed in something else, feel free to do all of that and come up with a list of values which are labeled as intrinsic, prudential, or systemic. So pause the video now. When you're done with the exercise, move ahead. We next come to the notion of value diagrams. Value diagrams are a way to communicate the experience of value to other people and also to ourselves. So, for instance, here is an environmentalist in Africa who considers wildlife to be of intrinsic value. And so the arrow that represents intrinsic value is this thick 3-barred arrow right here. So this is what we will use to denote intrinsic value. Now the environmentalist says tourism is important to us because the tourists bring in the money to support wildlife protection. So it's a thinner 2-bar arrow, it's a prudential value. A hotel operator in Africa says, yeah, tourism, I like it. I'm doing it for money. It's not a big deal. It's not an inseparable part of my identity. It brings me money. So tourism is a prudential value. Whereas wildlife is important because it brings the tourists. So wildlife is also prudential for me, and it's really important because it connects to tourism. So we have two people with entirely different value stories. We could have a third hotel operator who says, hold on a second, tourism is really fundamental to my identity. I love helping people see places, and that affects who I am as a person. I just love bridging cultures. So tourism is an intrinsic value for me. Wildlife continues to be a prudential value. So in the space of these two slides, we've just shown 3 different value stories. And that's the power of this notation. You can capture value frames or value stories with this notation of value diagrams. Next, we have what we call constrained value diagrams. Anytime we need to include systemic values in our value thinking, we will call those diagrams constrained. Why? Because systems are always a constraint on value. For example, visa regime is a system that decides who's going to come in and out of Africa. So that's a systemic value and it's a constraint. Other common examples, budgets or FDA approval for pharmaceutical decisions, these could exist in our value diagram. So systemic values are denoted by the thin arrow, single bar arrow. Next, we get to the notion of canonical value diagrams. So canonical form really means a pure form, and the intention behind this form is to force or encourage the decision maker to discover underlying sources of value behind systemic and prudential values. And we do that by banning a direct arrow from the systemic value to the value node. Systemic values must enter prudential values. Prudential values must ultimately enter intrinsic values. A prudential value can go into another prudential value, but ultimately, before it gets into the value node, it must connect to an intrinsic value source. Intrinsic values are declarations. There's no proof needed. In fact, you can't answer why they are important. Prudential value is about assertions. This is about things that we know about our universe. We believe something is good because of what we know. And systemic values are constraints. This is a brief summary of what we have discussed so far. Let's take an example. This is the value diagram of the president of Stanford University. And this was produced after an interview. And here we find that education is an intrinsic value of Stanford, according to the president, in that Stanford exists really to support and materialize this value. Prosperity of the university matters insofar as it supports the value of education. And resources expended have an impact on prosperity. So we care about resources only because it affects prosperity, and we care about prosperity because it affects our ability to educate. Next, we have two other values, intrinsic values, and this was drawn in the context of public safety on campus. So we have two negative intrinsic values, and to separate the negative from the positive, we've put plus and minus signs on these values. So trauma to the individual is a negative intrinsic value, or an intrinsic disvalue. What this is saying is, even if Stanford is totally insured and will never have to pay any money if there are any accidents on campus, we still don't want people to get hurt on campus. It's just an intrinsically bad idea. It affects us. We don't want people to be hurt. We want people to be safe. So that's the intrinsic value of the president of Stanford University as it applies to public safety. The third interesting intrinsic value of Stanford, again a disvalue, is coercion of others. Stanford is a voluntary organization and does not like the notion of forcing people against their will. So if you think about it in public safety or police work, you really are balancing these three things when you're on campus. So a campus police department has to trade off coercion with trauma. So they will jump in and use lethal force if they feel it is necessary to protect people. If someone's attacking someone else, then the police will use coercion in order to prevent trauma to the individuals concerned. Now, all of this safety happens in the context of the education mission. So any resources taken away from education are what you can give for these other things. So you're constantly trading off between education, trauma to the individual, and coercion in the context of public safety. So this value diagram elegantly summarizes what any public safety department needs to think about when they're in an educational setting on any campus in any university in the world. So of course that's given that they agree with these values and they make it their own. Another example, so based on some work I did with a Tibetan subject and a Han Chinese subject, we tried looking at what the Dalai Lama's value diagram would be according to the Han Chinese subject, and the person I spoke to grew up in Southeast Asia. So this subject felt that the Dalai Lama at the intrinsic level valued Tibetan independence, the continuation of the Dalai Lama institution, Tibetan Buddhism, and returning to Tibet in his own lifetime. He cared about diplomacy because diplomacy would help him get to the goal of independence, and his entire support of Western democracy was driven by a need for diplomacy. So this is how the Han Chinese subject saw the values of the Dalai Lama. Now, interesting enough, with our notation, we can kind of look at this diagram another way. We could say, well, is this in canonical form? And it's not, because the 3 out of the 4 intrinsic values are actually systemic values. So if you look at Tibetan independence, it's pretty clear that Tibetan independence is a system, as in you can tell very clearly when it's happened. It's not an inseparable part of myself that I can't measure. I can actually tell, okay, this Tibet is an independent country, and we know what we were talking about. Continuation of the Dalai Lama institution is also a binary flag, as in either the institution continues or it doesn't. Returning to Tibet in his own lifetime is also a very clear test, as in you can easily answer this question in a yes or a no. Tibetan Buddhism is the only thing that we really don't know how to articulate or measure. So the 3 arrows needed to be much thinner, and this actually shows more accurately how the Han Chinese subject was evaluating the Dalai Lama. This kind of gave a lot of interesting feedback to the Han Chinese subject that maybe he's placing intrinsic valuations on systemic values, which the Dalai Lama may or may not agree with. To take this to the next level, we decided to talk to the envoy of the Dalai Lama, the ex-envoy, who was on the Stanford campus, and he identified expression of the Tibetan identity as an intrinsic value, expression of Buddhism, expression of world citizenship. So these are the 3 intrinsic values that the Dalai Lama was firmly after, and economic and cultural freedom was important in order to support the Tibetan identity and the Buddhist identity. Nonviolent action was very important to preserve economic and cultural freedom. The nonviolent mindset was important to support nonviolent action, which would in its own way help the Tibetan people accept the Chinese rule, and that would connect with the expression of world citizenship, and it would do another interesting thing. It would trigger Chinese compassion, and that would enhance all the 3 freedoms. Now, although the Dalai Lama has often called himself a Marxist monk, one thing he's been very clear about is he's totally against coercion. So coercion is an intrinsic disvalue for him. So nonviolent action and Chinese compassion would reduce coercion in society. So one thing right off the bat that you can see from the value diagram is when we try it across 2 different sides, we may find that we routinely undervalue or underestimate what the other side really cares about. We simplify the other person's value diagram, and we make ours very rich and sophisticated, which is an interesting observation I've seen when drawing these diagrams. As a final comment, Dalai Lama keeps saying that he wants to benefit from the strength of the Chinese. Now this is quite a shock, as in when I showed it to the Chinese subject, he found it hard to believe. Initially he said, well, he wasn't sure, in fact, that this was genuine. And when I said, no, this is not some random Tibetan, this is somebody who has been very close to the Dalai Lama, he said he was okay with the diagram for the most part, because in that diagram there was no demand for independence, as he had initially thought in his diagram. Then he made some other comments, such as economic freedom does not lead to the expression of Tibetan identity. In fact, he felt that the economic freedom in Tibet was eroding their identity. A side note on that was the Uyghurs are very entrepreneurial, but not the Tibetans. They are rather laid back because of their religion, because 20% of Tibetan society, according to this subject, were monks, and hence this is very bad for production. This led an exercise to draw the Han Chinese own value diagram for Tibet. So in Tibet, he was valuing development of Tibet at an intrinsic level, and production would increase development, but the monastic culture would decrease production, so it was bad. That's what he was really saying. I showed these comments to the Tibetan subject, and the Tibetan subject said, well, monastic education and culture promotes more peaceful and compassionate actions within society and is the basis of ethics and positive general education. And I'm aware China is all about the booming development, but are they enough for the stability and long-term health of a society? So I took this back to the Han Chinese subject and I went back to his diagram. So I challenged him on this and I said, look, development of Tibet cannot be an intrinsic value because can you tell me why it's important? And he said, yeah, I can give you a whole bunch of reasons. Well then, if you can justify why it's important, it's a prudential value. It's not an intrinsic value. So we tried a bunch of other things and he came up with different values and all of them he could justify why they were important. So, and I kept rejecting them. And finally he said, look, why don't you tell me what the intrinsic value is here, given what you've heard so far? And I said to him, I think the intrinsic value for you is the well-being of everyone within China, including the Tibetans. When I said that, he just went silent and he didn't speak for a while. And then he said, yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, the Chinese have this term, Guo Jia, which means nation family. And this is deeply embedded in the Chinese consciousness. And once we understand this, we get a sense of why the Chinese get so irritated when people comment on national matters, because they treat national matters as family matters. The positive aspect of the same idea is they truly do see the Tibetans as part of their family, and the Han Chinese subject, he came up with some very interesting comments, and he felt that the Han Chinese in the US felt terrified to say anything against the Tibetans because they felt that they would be ostracized. And this was a first for me because I didn't expect any such thing in America where there's so much freedom of speech, but they felt that there was an almost this was a taboo topic. They could not talk about this without facing consequences either in their country or in the United States. So, and the other thing he mentioned to me was, if only the world would understand where we are coming from, our values, we would leave the Tibetans alone. We would give them much more freedom than the average Chinese gets. And right now he felt that the Chinese official reaction of being repressive in Tibet was an overreaction caused mainly because of the judgment of the world and the failure of the world to understand them. So very interesting viewpoints which I hadn't heard of before. So that's something that came out of this exercise. So it's kind of an interesting tool that when we try this in any conflict, the question is, do we really understand the values of the side that we are judging? And I've tried this in a bunch of other cases, and each time I've learned that people who have judgments about the other side often don't fully understand the values of the other side. Just a deep insight there. So bringing it back to the personal level, here's a provocative comment. You are your values. Put another way, you really are your intrinsic values. And that's a philosophical comment to digest. If you really think about it, when we act, when we interact with each other, what we're really sharing at the end of the day are our deepest values. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. So it's very important for us to know what is it that makes us tick, and to be able to communicate this to other people after we have clarity on it. So as our final exercise, lay out your intrinsic, prudential, and systemic values that you found in the previous exercise in a canonical notation. And the guide here is you want to use thick arrows for the intrinsic values, thinner arrows, the 2-barred arrows for the prudential ones, and the thinnest single bar arrows for the systemic values. And very quickly, I'll leave this template on the website so you can download this and you can pretty much copy this. So this makes it very simple. If you want to make a node, let's put a prudential value here. So I want an arrow. I'll go into home, shapes here. And now I want this to be a prudential arrow, so what I'll do is I'll click on this and click on Format Painter and then make this prudential. I can do the same thing if I want another intrinsic value. So let me choose the arrow. connect it here, choose the intrinsic value, format painter, boom. And if I want a systemic value, I can put that here, put an arrow here, format the painter to get it a little thicker than this. There it is. Okay, so I can move my diagram around and arrange it. And of course, you wouldn't be having question marks. These would be labels that resonate with you. As you do this exercise, keep asking yourself this question: are my intrinsic values truly intrinsic? As in, can I count it easily? Do I know how to separate it from myself? If I can separate from myself, it's not intrinsic. It's more practical. And if I can count it, it's systemic. So that's a question you want to ask yourself as you're drawing these diagrams. So happy drawing of value diagrams, and I would love to see what you come up with. So do share it with me. Thank you so much for listening.